Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be taking a look at UV maps and ways to leverage them inside of vMix's virtual sets. And our goal here is to try to show some different ways that you could create interesting visual compositions beyond the traditional virtual set that people would use to substitute for an actual set. But before we get to that, I invite everyone, please share if you have any feedback, have any questions, just share it in the comments below, and we'll be happy to get to it here on air. And if we have an answer, if we can comment on it, we'll certainly welcome any feedback you can give us. So, Rudy, thank you for joining us. Always good to see you. So, I also, if you would like to join us on the show via video call-in, please, you can connect with us through the URL we'll post up on the screen. And if you go there, somebody from the studio will get you on, and we'll have you on air with us to talk. So, all right, let's get started. So, we all know virtual, John, thank you for dropping in here today. And I also saw Richard. Richard, thank you for making the time to come in. This is great. So we've all seen virtual sets in different incarnations, but one of the things that I think is an interesting use for virtual sets is different ways to present information that you may want to share with an audience in a more dynamic way. So one of the examples we're going to go through today would be something that would let you introduce panels for, say you're at some sort of event or conference, a way that you could set up and show panelists that will be part of each panel. So if I switch over here to the output, I have a virtual set that I have set up here, and I have the ability now to, let me just set this up. So I could actually take and put panelists into this virtual set, switch them back, change panelists for the next show. And this gives me now an interesting layout that can be a little more dynamic with some of the things you can do in virtual sets. But it really is just a simple way of creating dynamic graphics that you can use in your shows. So to understand this, it really, Peter, thank you for joining us from Berlin. Always great to have you. So to understand how a virtual set is composed, there's a few elements here that I want to go through. And so probably the first one is, how do you take and map elements into a virtual set? So you've seen it with everything from video to other types of graphics. So the way you would do that is through something called UV maps. So in the set that we just showed you, there are multiple UV maps that we're using here. So probably a good place to start is just talking about a UV map in general. So the way a UV map works is it works as a coordinate system that says, I want to take every pixel that I have inside of this UV map, and I want to map that to a pixel inside a video or an image that you are now mapping into the space this UV map has. And the way this works, and this is pretty universal, it isn't just in vMix. The way UV maps work is they create a color gradient which goes from 0 to 65,000 in red and 0 to 65,000 in green. And so each pixel as you go across has, one color green, starts from 0 all the way up to 65,000 and stacked in. So you effectively make a very, very detailed coordinate system in two directions. And in this, it doesn't use the blue color at all in an RGB color space. So we create in a gradient, in this type of gradient, that type of image to position map. Now, if I distort this, if I were to bend it or twist it or cut it up, that information now goes with that component. So if I have an image mapped to a gradient and I cut that gradient into pieces, that image effectively gets cut into pieces the same way. And that gives us a lot of flexibility for things we can do inside of layouts. So one of the things you have noticed is that we had images of the panelists that were placed across the screen. And the way we did that is we took an image that they were on and laid in the gradient maps for that image, cut it up, and positioned them on the screen. So let me just take a second here to show you what this would look like. So, Mazir, thank you. Great to have you here. So this is the image that we used for that first example that we set up. And you can see that we have the 4 guests, and those correspond, if I just switch to the 4 gradients we had cut up here. The other thing you'll notice is that we also had their title and their company and their name positioned below them on the floor. And what we did is we used this gradient map to do that. And this gradient map was taking these images that we have along the side, one corresponding to each one of the guests, and mapping that now onto a space on the floor. And finally, we have the title that we used for what the event was, the panel was going to discuss, and that is mapping this area of the image right here across the top. So there's a lot of power in this. And if you look at this as sort of a composited set of layers, and in fact, I will open this up into layers. What you're basically seeing with layers is you have the virtual set background, and then you have the different UV maps. The map that we have that's being used for the topic, then the panelists that go across, and then their names on the floor in front of them. So it's a very straightforward layering technique, just like you'd use in vMix for doing multi-views, or what are now called layers. It's using the same core technology, but with a few twists inside. So if we sort of jump back, the next thing to think, Sir Sirkanth, I hope I'm saying your name right. Thank you for joining us. And great to have you from India. That's fantastic. So what we have to do when we set this up is not only do we have to have all these components that we set up, all these different layers and the gradients, but we need to have a way to tell vMix how to actually take and work with these layers. How does it manage them? And this comes back to our good friend XML. So I have a XML file here, which is exactly what is used inside of vMix to describe a virtual set. So I won't go into tremendous detail, but I want to cover some key things. George, great to see you here. Hope everything's going well for you. So we have at the top in traditional XML, we have the block which says virtual set and ends at the bottom with a /virtual set, which sort of frames that piece of the XML code. And then we have sets of inputs. These are basically the layers that will be used inside of vMix to construct the virtual set. And then we have zoom positions, which I'll go into when we look at virtual sets, but they basically allow you to preset different types of zooms that you can jump into or sort of pan into as you manipulate the virtual set. So let's go up though and look at the inputs. So there are a couple of types of inputs here, but all of them follow the same basic template. They say, what's the name you want to give to this layer, this input inside of your virtual set? then you have all the coordinate things. I can position it X and Y, I can zoom in and out, I can rotate it, everything you'd need to describe its position over time, inside of the set. And then you actually can list the image that's going to be used. So in this case, that's just that background that we had of sort of the stage with the big wall behind it. And so this gives us a sort of a backdrop framework that we then layer everything else on. Now, the other images that we have, the other inputs we have here, are all UV maps. And this is where it gets a little more interesting. So I can name them, which I have. I have the panel topic, panel images, and panel title. And again, they have all the same elements here that you would have for a positioning that you'd have in a standard static image. But now they add a few more things at the end that are important. So the first thing we add is something that says dynamic equals true, this part right here. And what that's telling us, or telling vMix, is that the person that is using this virtual set can map an image to the UV map that's here. So that lets that person select the image that they want to map. So in our case, what we did when we went to the virtual set is we took the image of those guests and set that up as the dynamic input that we set to true. And each one of these now took that same image and mapped it to a different UV map that we have set up here. And those are these PNG files. So this means that as we put this together, every time we change the image that we assign to the map here, all of the set components will change. So you have a simple way to take and bundle information into a single image and then spread that out in a dynamic layout that can sometimes communicate a much better story than you could with simple lower thirds or other things like that. So, Mady the Great, thank you for joining us. So, this is a file that goes inside the directory where we keep all of our components for a virtual set. So we've probably covered enough here. We can talk about this more in the post-show if you'd like. But what I'd probably like to do right now, Girish, thank you for joining here. I'm actually going to slide out of vMix for a second, and I'm going to open up the directory where I have one of my virtual sets. So let me slide this over here. And so this is the directory inside of vMix that vMix would leverage for a complete virtual set. And I just want to let everybody sort of see what's in here. So this config.xml file is that XML file we just went through. I have in the same directory the 3 UV maps that we set up. Actually, we have one extra, which I will talk about in a minute. And we also have the image of the background that we have in the virtual set. And then to make the virtual set easier to find if you're looking for it, there is a thumbnail here. So if you open this inside of vMix, you would actually see the thumbnail of this virtual set. So it gives you a visual cue as to what's going on. So that really is all that's involved. You take the elements, and then you take an XML file, and this, inside of vMix, is a virtual set. So very, very straightforward once you sort of grasp the overall way these sets are composed. So let me jump back over here into vMix. And so I just want to jump into to call out a few things here. So if let me see. Okay, so here's some of the things that you might not have noticed. The elements here that I set up for the names, these are these UV gradient maps that we have down here on the floor. These are taking part of the image with their company name, logo, and other things. they are transforming that. So this is part of the thing you get from using gradients, is that you can bend them and twist them and put them into different positions. So I am transforming them and making them semi-transparent so they have a better blend with the floor. And that's actually really useful for doing all types of things, especially if you want to do things that are not just flat, but want to do things that may wrap around a pole or do other things in your flat space, creating that illusion of depth. And so I have that here. The other thing you'll notice is that I have these reflections coming in. If you remember, we talked about reflections in a previous show we did with masking. This is where a lot of that gradient work originated, where we are just taking the same gradient, flipping it down, and fading it out, and making it semi-transparent as well to create that illusion of a reflection. So that's the other thing that we've done. The third thing in here is we actually are using a mask. So we've talked about masks before, but that's how we cut out each of these people. So if this is something where you had a photo of people that were going to be at a conference, you don't necessarily need a full body shot, but you could do something similar to this with positioning everybody behind a desk and having little name cards in front of the desk, something like that. But you can do the same type of thing here, where you could use the green screen or a solid background, cut that out with an alpha map, and then these people that are standing there are transparent in all the open spaces around them, and you can see the set that you have behind it. So this is just some of that layering in action. But there's another set. Dennis, greetings. Thank you for joining us. But there's another set I put together that actually is using video coming in. So let me switch over to that. It uses almost all of the same elements here, except now what we're doing is we're taking a video feed coming in and cutting that video feed up into 4 different monitors. So the reason I'm showing this is because I think there could be some interesting ways potentially that you could use this to move between remote guests. And I'm all about finding different ways to engage with your viewers, and especially with incorporating remote people into your productions, because everybody's can get zoomed out with just looking at people in static boxes. And now you could do things like zoom in and go to people at a side as they talk, or have them slide across and move in the set, or pull back to full when everybody's talking. Now, I'm not saying that this design and layout is something I would necessarily emulate. It was really done just for purposes of an example. But you still get to do a lot of the same things. So I can have, like you see here, across the bottom, all the names of the people that could be talking inside of the monitors. And we actually crop them, so this gives you more of a pillar effect. But this is also, in many ways, more natural. If I wanted to put these people, say, around a table, I could have set up these monitors around tables and create that sense of a panel that's actually talking. So different ways to communicate using virtual sets, where the set itself is simply a design element that helps engage with an audience, as opposed to being a substitute for the physical set that you may be in. And it also, in many ways, because we are dealing with so many remote people, it becomes the one common set that you can position everybody in. So even though you have people from different remote locations, you can use a virtual set as a way to establish a common space that everybody's going to be communicating from. And in some ways, that creates a more natural, more comfortable feel for people, where they stop feeling like they're necessarily on a conference call and much more engaged with the audience as a panel in a traditional live space. So this is just a another way to think about using UV maps and virtual sets inside of vMix to composite and communicate better with audiences. So that's everything that I wanted to cover today. I know this show is probably a little shorter than usual, but I thought there were a lot of things from here that potentially everyone could take and incorporate themselves. And I also want to encourage you to dive into creating some of your own virtual sets. It isn't something that is incredibly difficult. It just needs to have some rules followed. And you should be very successful with doing that on your own, creating your own branding and imaging around that. A few things to keep in mind when you create your own sets is that the UV gradients are very high color bit depth. So you need to get up to 65,000. So these if you remember, we talked about this being a coordinate system. So you actually need to have really a 64-bit color space inside of vMix. That's what's required to create these smooth types of gradient mappings. And so when you are working in something like Photoshop, it usually defaults to 8 bits per color. And that means that in that 8-bit per color space, you have 8 red, 8 blue, 8 green, and then 8 alpha. That's, your 4 times 8 that's your 32-bit space. So you need to at least be in sort of double that, 16 bits for each one of the color channels, so you can capture that 0 to 65,000 mapping that you need for UV maps to work. So that's something to keep in mind when a lot of people come back and say, my mapping looks terrible, everything looks blurred, or the edges are all jagged. That's the reason. You're using too small a color space for your... Oh, Samuel, hi. Greetings from New Jersey here in the States. So that's something that definitely keep in mind. And the other thing is to understand that you can cut these up. So you don't have to do one-to-one mappings. You can put multiple things on a single image and use the gradients to cut those up. So another thing that can make things simpler. So in these virtual sets that we showed here, we actually use the same image and just for different layers and just cut it up differently for each one of those layers. So again, something to keep in mind as a way to streamline things you may have to do pre-production before your shows. So we will be staying around after the show to have a more casual discussion. If you have any questions or want to discuss anything with us that we covered on the show or just video production in general. And again, I invite everyone to, if you'd like to join us here on the show, you can just go to our call-in link and somebody here will be able to get you on. And, we're very, very casual in the after show. So this is something that I want everybody to feel you're just welcome to ask any questions, and we'll try to cover anything you want. So if I don't see you in the after show, I'll see you all next Friday. Thanks for joining. Take care. Welcome back, everyone. So even though this was a shorter show, I think we covered a lot of important components to understanding UV maps and to working with them in vMix through virtual sets. One of the things that, Tom, so yes, Tom's asking if we have a place for the XML files for this show and for previous shows. I have to take the blame for that. We've been swamped, but yes, we actually have set up a GitHub account, and we're going to be posting those links. I had hoped to get that done for this week, but unfortunately, with everything we had going on, I didn't have a chance. But so we will be putting that up in the group, and we'll be putting that up on the page in Facebook, and I'll also post it as a comment on YouTube. So I want to thank everybody who's been subscribing on YouTube. It's great to see that community grow, and hopefully everybody there doesn't feel disconnected because I post a lot of stuff on Facebook for these types of things. So I'm going to make an effort now to make sure that when we post things in Facebook, that we also cover them in the comment section on YouTube for everybody watching there. But so that it will be in the comments on YouTube and in our group and our page on Facebook, the links to the GitHub, which will have all of these elements published in it. So thank you for asking that, Tom. So Gary, oh yeah, I mean the 16-bit color space is really important because it is a coordinate system. So when you go to the 8-bit color space, the reason everything looks so choppy is because you basically only have 256 by 256 bit coordinate space. So that's the full space. So when everything looks like it's sort of early Nintendo game pixelization, that's why that makes a big difference. And it does it does get to you after a while. You sometimes are working, and I know for myself, I've done things with virtual sets where I built lots of stuff, and then I realize, oh my gosh, I'm working in 8-bit per color mode. So that's something that gets to all of us. So definitely a thing to keep top of mind when you're going to do anything with UV maps. But where I had originally thought of using this was for teams. If you say you had a soccer league and you wanted to show the different teams and lay them out on a field, this is a perfect use case where you can have one image with everybody's picture on the team and their sort of name and position, and then cut that up into a field with all of these gradients laid out for each one of those positions. And then week to week, team to team, you just put a new image in and everything works and all those layouts work. So it can simplify things as an awful lot for some of the things that you have to do on a production level. So yes, so Michael is mentioning that there is on the vMix knowledge base a UV map. It comes in a zip file. So that's something I'd recommend you definitely start with that. And make sure when you do that you sort of keep that zip file, because you'll probably destroy your UV map a few times as you work through things. I do it all the time. So I keep sort of a set of Photoshop files with good UV maps in them, and I call them up to start when I do new work these days. So that's just one technique. But these types of things where you want to take and just have an image that you can then map into different creative things, I think is a great use case for UV maps and virtual sets. And again, this just gives you another way to communicate. So Gary's asking, could you show how you chopped up the UV map to grab the different parts of the panel? So I don't actually have Photoshop on here, but let me switch back to this over here, see if I can sort of go through here. So what I'm going to do here, let me see. I'll work dynamically here. So let me see if I can add a layer on top of here, which has, so here is the panel. So this is probably a pretty good way to look at this. So what I've done here is I've taken and cut out, so let's put this in preview. So when I've cut out each of these people, what I'm doing is I'm taking this part of the gradient that they're standing in front of, cutting that out, and then sizing and positioning it. So this is exactly what you see here for how this works through. You have this piece of the gradient over here, this component over here, and so on. So this is just moving across, cutting out the part that's behind the image you want. And for the names over here, all we've done here is we've taken this piece, cut out this element here, and resized and scaled it. And we basically, inside of Photoshop, use the transform distort to do this. So this gives you really just this layered map. And now if I were to change the image that's on top of here, so again, we'll just, if I went here and said, let me pick panel 2, these things, these cutouts that we did are identical. So just by changing the image now, all of these things that we showed in the set are changed, because you're basically saying, map this image to this UV map, and each part of this UV map takes the image that was mapped to it and displays it in the set. So sorry I don't have, Photoshop here to do that, but this hopefully gives you a better sense for how that would work when you do that type of cutout and recomposite. So the other thing, so one of the things that we're taking, if you remember the setup that we did, let me switch over to the monitor set over here. And then here, if you remember the way we set these up over here, all we had to do for these is we have one video coming in from live to air, and that's our quad video, which has all 4 guests sort of cut out into quadrants. And we just took the UV map, laid this onto a UV map, and cut out the center piece for each of these guests. So they fit in here. So basically, all we were doing one-to-one is we took this piece of the gradient and laid it into the set behind a monitor. And so that's how we did this. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the full size. You can cut up little bits of it and position it any way you want. And again, we're just using the same sort of name layouts here as another way to do this. But it does give you some flexibility around how you do these types of mappings. And again, it gets to my thing about trying to find interesting and creative ways to work with remote people. Because I think if you just stared at this type of view all day, it doesn't have quite the same level of engagement. And ultimately, that's what, when you do these productions, people are looking for that. How much do the people that are watching take away? How connected do they feel? So anything you can do that could make that more interesting, I think is a positive. Creative. Try to figure out different ways to capture people's attention and keep them engaged. So, okay, on May last week question, my setup is 2 A7 S3s. So Mady was asking about systems that you could use for production. Now, he has phenomenal gear there. So in terms of software, I think vMix is definitely sort of top of the list for me in terms of I'm building my own hardware, or I'm buying hardware, and I am just looking to run software on it to do my productions. It has the most depth to it, and I think part of what we've talked about with scripting is that you can end up making vMix even more powerful, especially around automation. And that's another big thing. Automation is key to making your productions richer and more engaging. The fact that a tool is there that can do things like Livestream Studio is really a nice switcher, but at least the last time I was involved with it, the automation isn't there. And the same with Wirecast. Wirecast has some great simple features, very much a sort of a layered view like you'd get almost with Photoshop, but for video, but you don't have automation tools around that. So if it isn't something that you can do easily by manipulating what's available to you in the UI, then it becomes more difficult. But things that we showed where you had the different guests go up in size and then swap as you were introduced to each guest, that sort of stuff you couldn't do manually. You really need some type of automation tool to do that. And that's one of the places where vMix really excels. Now, for a variety of reasons, we use TriCaster here, but that is a all-in-one, so it's hardware and software bundled together into a single solution. And it's for, a multitude of reasons that we've settled on that. But I think as a software distinct product, vMix is definitely, on the top there. So let's see, are there any other questions or let's see. So Mady said, my problem is it does not support LUTs. So yes, so for those who don't know what a LUT is a lookup table. And for a lot of cameras, in order to increase dynamic range, they'll use a color space, basically something that describes the color of each pixel that is not linear. So it tries to, when you capture images, it tries to provide something that would be ideal in post-production for doing a transformation, where you can not blow out the brights but not crush all the blacks, so the dark, so that you just become solid black. And lookup tables are basically a way to say, I'm going to take that sort of very particular color space for enhanced dynamic range and map it into a visually pleasing color space that people would be comfortable looking at. So that would be, where you get the different rec color spaces. That's the types of things that you would be doing here. So there isn't a good way in vMix, as far as I know, to apply a LUT to a video source. But a lot of the cameras actually will let you apply a LUT to the video that streams out. So that could be a way, if you're going to be streaming live, to use a standard LUT that would have a reasonable color space stream out the camera. But I agree with you, May. There isn't a way in vMix that I know of to do that, other than trying to sort of play with the color wheels, which can get you part of the way there, but it is probably far from optimal and not very exact. So, all right. Are there any other questions or anything else anybody wants to talk about? Well, because I know there's a lag, so I'll wait for things to come in here if you have anything that you want to add. But I'm definitely interested if there are now. The last couple of shows we've done have been driven in large part out of feedback that we've received from people for things they'd like to have covered. So please, if you have an interest in specific topics, they don't have to be specifically around vMix or anything, anything even in switcher type software. It could be something that would be general video technologies, things that you'd like to see reviewed. So, Mady, I don't believe Wirecast has LUTs. I could be wrong. I'm not as familiar with Wirecast and that sort of level, but I don't believe it supports sort of LUTs directly, mapped to a video source coming in from that. So, sorry if that's nothing good there. So, do you have a UV from a single image or video? So, the concept. So this is Tom asking about how the UV maps work. So when you have a UV map, which is that color gradient, and you tell it to assign an image or a video to it, it now will take and map each pixel in that image or video to its corresponding pixel that it lays over in the UV map. And when you make any changes to the UV map, those pixels travel with it. So if I just took a UV map, cut it in half, and separated it, it would take the image or video and separate it the same way I separated the UV map once that map is made. So uh, you don't have to have it to be one-to-one, but that means that you can take a single image and cut it up, or a single video and cut it up. The other thing that I know people have done is they've taken and created video feeds that are cut up around elements that they want to put into their virtual sets to map to UV maps. So for instance, they would have video coming in which would have the host, but maybe a ticker, like a stock quote ticker, streaming across the top, and they'll use a UV map to cut out the ticker, put that around something that may be wrapping around a desk as a stock ticker, and then use the host video. So they take one feed in and they use that with multiple UV mappings. But you can do it across multiples as well. So you could send in tickers and motion graphics and other types of signage that you'd have in a virtual set through one, and the guest or the host coming in through others. So it isn't a fixed approach, but it's just the flexibility of having that map and being able to cut that map up and effectively cut up whatever image or video you send in. So let's see, how to block ability to start streaming unless output is set to a particular scene. So, Powell, hopefully I'm saying your name right. A lot of this stuff would come through scripting. So if you want to set something up, probably the best way to do this would be, when you want to start streaming, to actually set up a script that configures everything exactly the way you want it in that initial script. And then once that configuration has happened, either through another script or at the end of that script, you can then do things like, let me start the recording, let me start the streaming. This is something that I know a lot of people, do as a way to reset a configuration. Now, when you are using, when you set something up in vMix or any switcher and you're working with it, you tend to switch things around and load in other elements and potentially not have everything set up the way you'd want for your next show. So having a script that will actually use that, can you reset that session to be where you need it to start, can be very valuable. For people that use the TriCaster, what we recommend for that is you can create a session template and use that template to create new sessions. So that's another way to make sure that if you start a session afresh, you're working from a known start point. But for all of us, this is something where lots of times, even though you loaded that fresh session in, you probably went through a rehearsal and may have switched things around. So you can actually then, if you're thinking about this, you then end up with the same position where now everything is sort of in an unknown state. So even with things where you have templates, having that reset could be really helpful. So that would be the way I would do it. You definitely could check to see what is your active output and refuse to start a stream until that happens. But I think the other way around is probably more useful to you as a production workflow. So James, an in-depth of the live to air program. That is something that if people are interested in, we definitely would like to do that. I think there are some interesting bits in there that are workflow related. So that is on our list. We weren't sort of pushing that out there because we don't want to basically become one big commercial. But I think there's definitely things inside of live to air that might be interesting to a broader segment of our community here. So definitely something we would look to do at some point in the future. So the one of the interesting things for picking shows is trying to figure out the right balance of things to cover. And what we've seen as in the community right now is that there's a lot of interest in vMix and around automation in vMix. So this would be something that we've been focused more on recently. But if there are other topics, we definitely want to make sure we're not alienating anybody else with other tools that they use. So, if you got things in Wirecast you'd like to see us cover or Live Stream Studio, these are things that we'd be glad to take on and go through. Also, if there are technical things. Now, in last season, we covered a lot of foundational things around lenses and camera senses and lighting. So we did some background work with that. But if there are other topics like green screen work, chroma keying that we really haven't covered in great depth, those are other things that we'd be interested to cover if it's stuff that all of you would be interested in. So, like I said, just send feedback. You can send it to us, directly through messaging, or just post it in any of the comments, and we read all of it, and we'd love to accommodate a lot of different interest out there in this production space. So, all right. So, anything else? Let me just go through the list here. All right. So I think we've covered everything in the comments. So Matey just jumped in at the last minute. He's asking, so vMix is the top dog, as I understand it. There's no better software. I think right now, vMix probably has the most capability of any of the software-based switchers that are out there. It has its own issues. So I don't want to come across as a fanboy. I mean, I think the UI can be challenging sometimes. It's very easy to end up with 150 inputs and then try to work through that as you build productions. And I know a lot of people that have used this where they have lots of inputs, but they're afraid to cut them out because they don't know what they're mapped to, and they don't want to break something, so that you tend to sort of accumulate inputs as you go along. So there are some downsides to it, but I think if you are disciplined around building your vMix sessions and you leverage automation, things like Stream Decks, things like scripting to run through the productions, vMix probably has the most capability of any of the software switchers that are out there. So this is a great, the great thing to consider though, as you look at these, is that you don't have to stick with one tool. And because of things like NDI, and I've mentioned it before, we use OBS here for things like signage, and that's just NDI feeds, but we've used it for other things. We use OBS for webcam inputs, so we can use that as a way to send feeds for webcams when we do tutorials or other types of things. Like everybody that you see coming in here through the monitors that we had in today's session, those are just coming from vMix and OBS as video loops that we use for the webcam. So you can start to think of these as broad tool sets stitched together using things like NDI and combining it all with automation to create production solutions, as opposed to feeling that you have to live just within a single tool, because there is no easy way to stitch things. There are lots of ways to integrate tools today. So, All right, everyone. So thanks for hanging around after the show. I always like this part of the show. It's a little more casual and we can go off wherever our muse leads us to talk about any topics. So thank you all. I'll see you next Friday. And until then, have a great week. Be safe. Take care.